Welcome to a rebroadcast of the Urban Christian Institute. I am going to be sharing a debate with you that took place this past Tuesday. Um, the 12th, regarding biblical justice and fair wages. This debate was between Chris Bryant Samuel and his good friend Steve S. I cannot pronounce his last name, and I'm so sorry. But I do have the description in the video. But they take part in a public discussion surrounding the notion of fair wages advocacy by Christians. So I just wanted to share that with you. It was really good, and I wanted to share that with you. I know you'll be blessed. What I do need people to do, because it was a few issues, and there was some issues with the volume. And once again, I I'm not at all tech savvy, but I can read and I can figure things out. But y'all just let me know if you guys can hear it. But I am going to go ahead and share that video with you guys now. So if you'll just stand by, I'm gonna go ahead and let y'all have it. Now, I do apologize, but this debate kind of takes place already 2 minutes in at the beginning. So I just want you to be mindful of that. But we're going to pop in and drop in on Mr. Steve making his opening statement. All right, just one moment.
Colossians 1:9. He talks to those two churches, Philippi and Colossae, and says, I've heard about your love, and I want it to abound more and more with knowledge and discernment. That's in Philippians. In Colossians, I've heard about your love, and I'm not ceasing to pray for you. I'm asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding. It's not enough to love. We have to know what to do. And that's what Paul's prayer for them is. And that's what I think we need to focus on. Love alone will not protect us from false teachings, and it's not going to protect us from taking harmful actions. And I can give some examples. So if you say, hey, I'm an activist, and this is the thing I advocate for, and I'm an activist, and I advocate for the exact opposite, both of us might have love. We might be motivated by love. But only one of us is loving our neighbor if the exact opposite action is not loving our neighbor. Voting is to me kind of an example. There's a lot of push on how important it is to vote. And I don't think it's that important to vote. I think what matters is who you vote for. And I'm not, what moral choices are there? And I'm not sure there was moral choices on the ballot this time, but it's not so important to vote. And in fact, raw democracy, where we take without any checks and balances, raw democracy is something that's actually incompatible with Christianity. If the Christian doctrine of sin is that people are evil and corrupt, and so to decide what 51% of evil and corrupt people want is not a logical thing. We don't want that. So those a couple examples of how that relates to love. There was a church in Atlanta, I believe, and they kind of adopted a community in Africa, and the community didn't have any eggs. And the church in Atlanta, out of an expression of love, got eggs and basically supplied that village with these eggs for free. And the village had free eggs. At the same time, people in the village were trying to start businesses to get eggs to people, and the people would have to pay for them, but that was sustainable. The church was doing this for a while. The people that wanted to supply eggs went out of business. They couldn't make any money. They can't compete against free eggs. And then the church got bored after 6 months and stopped, and now the village has no eggs. They had the love. They didn't have knowledge. Same thing happened. Textiles is another example. In America, we send all our used clothes all to third world countries. And people, if you look, you can go to North Korea and people have a Nike hat on that they got from someone in South Korea, that they got from someone in America. And there's people in those places trying to start textile companies, but they can't compete with free textiles. So the minute we stop sending them free textiles, we've done damage to their economy. So those are examples of how love without knowledge can actually be a very harmful thing. The road to hell is paved with love without knowledge. That's what good intentions are. Fortunately, Jesus wasn't just ripping when he said, love your neighbors. He wasn't just making that up on the fly. He was referencing Leviticus 19. Leviticus 19 is describing a framework for justice. And I'm going to attempt to apply its principles to labor and wage practices. And then in this first segment, I'll lay out the principle. And then in the next 10 minutes, maybe we can talk about some modern examples with modern companies. So justice is how we love our neighbors. Justice is the aggregation of the kind of love Jesus is talking about. So if we take a look at Leviticus 19 here, it can be broken up into 5 sections. So you can see Leviticus 19, this whole section is referred to as loving your neighbor. And the conclusion is this is how you love your neighbor as yourself. This is what Jesus was talking about. He didn't want you to just make sure you give your neighbor a cup of sugar or you're kind to the initial neighbor when he moves in. He's talking about the aggregation of those things, which is justice impartially applied to all of your neighbors. The first is commands for the rich. And this is kind of a metonymy. It's referring to someone who owns land, who owns a farm. And he's telling them, when you reap the harvest of your land, don't reap the fields right up to the edge. Leave something on the edges for the poor and for the foreigner, for the sojourner. And the reason you're doing that is so that they will have something to eat. So there's commands for the rich there. And when conservatives, like political conservatives read this passage, they skip this one. And then maybe political progressives skip some of the other ones below it. So there's part of this, in this case, the land that you own, the edges are left there for the poor. You have, and there's similar commands. Deuteronomy 15:7 says, do not harden your heart against the poor. But there's also commands in this related that are given to the poor in this process, right? So you'll notice that you're leaving the edges for the poor. You're not leaving them food, you're leaving them work. And you can see in the, and you're not giving up your rights to the property that you own. You're giving someone the ability to work off of that property. And you can see from Ruth and Boaz as an example. When Ruth goes to Boaz, you can see there's not, it's not that Boaz does not have the right to the edges of his field. Ruth 2:2, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. Right? Boaz still has the rights to that field, but he has the responsibility to use that property to allow the poor to glean their own harvest. And there's other examples where when the poor, and Deuteronomy 23:24 talks about when you're going into a neighbor's field to get food, you're not allowed to bring a basket. You're not allowed to develop a system where you're feeding off of your neighbor. This is about your right to life, right? You're allowed to get a meal's worth. You can't bring a basket, eat everything you take when you go into the field, but you're not going to build a process out of it. You're not going to hire a tax collector who's going to take the edges of the field. This is how you can get the principle of preservation of life is higher than the principle of the property rights in this case. And that's what the edges of the field are for. It goes on in verse 11, you can see here, the second part, where the idea is that you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't deal falsely, don't lie to one another. All right. Verse 13, do not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hard worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning, right? So when you're paying someone some agreed upon wage, you don't have the right to take the money or to withhold money for different reasons. And that's something that I don't think is very different now. I've been in jobs when I was younger where someone would mess around and not pay me. I bet that's easily transferable from then to now. When you need money for food to eat, you need money for food to eat, and this is an unrighteous thing to do. Not withholding wages. Don't place barriers. Verse 14, don't place barriers. So for example, don't curse the deaf. They can't hear you. That's an unfair practice. Or don't put a stumbling block before the blind. They can't see it. It's an unfair practice. So I think I see things like, to me, minimum wage is an example of this. And it sounds counterintuitive, but when you're a large company and you say, hey, I want to make a minimum wage of $15, you're telling small companies they can't go into two adults can't have an agreement to work for $10 an hour. You're putting a barrier in front of the small company who can't afford $10 an hour, and you're putting a barrier for the employee that's willing to work for $10 an hour. I think that's an example of that. Going on to 15. How are we doing on time? Going on to verse 15. Don't use the law in unjust ways. Don't be partial to the poor or defer to the great, right? So you can't use the law. The depth of someone's pockets doesn't degrade the amount of justice they get. You can't sue someone who's rich simply because they're rich. You can't say, well, this person has a lot of money, this person has less money, so justice must push these two things in the opposite direction. That's using the court in an unjust way. You can't go around slandering among your people. You not stand up against the life of your neighbor. Don't threaten to kill someone. So next one is in verse 17. Don't hate your brother in your heart. Reason frankly with your neighbor. And what I think this goes really well with the idea of someone who owns land, who leaves the corner of his property. And you can see in the book, the story with Ruth and Boaz, how there's a relationship there. They're asking, hey, if I find favor with this person, I'm going to be able to work in their field. And there's a relationship there. You're willing to work, to reason frankly. That way you won't incur sin because of that person. Do not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your people. So there's something, the idea of a reparation, or someone, you can sue someone because they've done something for you. That's an idea that is using the courts properly, right? And reparation might be, there was a guy who made cigarettes, and he got everyone. He didn't just make the cigarettes, but he made them in a way that they would hook people. And you got lung cancer because you smoked his cigarettes and you're addicted to smoking cigarettes. You may be able to sue him. That's not revenge. You're suing the person who did that. Maybe he died and he has an estate. You can sue his estate because of the damage that was done to you. But suing everyone who's named Winston in Salem, that's taking vengeance or bearing a grudge against your sons or your people. And then it's this way that you will love your neighbor as yourself. And it's this way that love aggregates when it's applied impartially to everyone to be justice. So these 5 principles, I think you have what Jesus says is summation of the law, what it is to love your neighbor. And I think I can demonstrate that Old Testament principles can be translated into modern contexts in 3 categories. The first is a rule of law, a lack of partiality in the law, and property rights. If you can't start with those, then then you may be motivated by love, but the result will not be just. The second is laissez-faire capitalism. This is basically the premise that any two adults should be free from fiscal, trade, and regulatory policies that might restrict them from freely associating and negotiating wages and other contracts. Meaning people who are rich can't use the law to force people to work for a certain wage or force other companies not to be allowed to hire people. You can't take a ladder of success and remove the lowest rungs from it. Okay, in 1 Timothy 5:13, Paul warns us against busybodies who are idle, going about from house to house. A busybody instructs others as what wages are correct, while what the lowest wage must be. Many economies were destroyed by political busybodies. The average poverty rate was shrinking for 5 years until Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty in 1964, and it appears evident to me that poverty is going to win. So the rule of law, property rights, laissez-faire capitalism, and the third is sound money. When the federal government can produce money on a whim and hand it out to whoever they choose, you have what the Old Testament refers to as unequal weights and measures, right? An unequal weight is you're weighing out a certain amount of some commodity that you purchase. You have a weight that weighs a pound.
5 minutes.
You have something that weighs a little less, so you can get that's unequal weights and measures. Unequal weights were used to rip people off when weighing something out, and that's what's happening. It causes inflation, and inflation is a tax, right? So the government has 3 options when they want to tax you. Did you say 5, Scott?
You're at 4.5 now.
Okay. The government has 3 options when they want to tax you. They can tax you directly, which is the most honest option. They can tax you through debt. They won't get elected again if they do that first option. They can tax you through debt, or they can inflate the currency, which makes the value of the currency go down, and it makes the cost of commodities go up. And rich people can just buy Tesla stocks, right? Poor people are buying milk and eggs with that. So inflation is a tax on the poor. These principles are what should guide wages. Wages are built on the foundation of property rights, freedom of association and contracts, and sound money. This is what raises wages up and removes disparities. This is why Leviticus 19 isn't proposing what a specific wage should be. It's describing a framework and environment that lifts all people up. And in fact, Deuteronomy 15:45 tells us that when applied, there's not going to be any poor among us. When you apply the principles of the Old Testament, there will be no poor. Now, it's not talking about, there's still going to be people who blow their money gambling or doing whatever. It's not saying that no individual person is not going to fall into a property. It's saying that we're not going to have a systemic creation of poverty if this is applied correctly. So it's not referring to a kind of a utopia. It's referring to biblical principles that I think translate into those 3 principles: a rule of law that includes property rights, laissez-faire capitalism, which is basically trade policy, fiscal policy, and regulatory policy that matches these 5 principles in Leviticus 19 and does not trample over people, does not put unfair barriers for people, whether they're the employee or the employer. And third, sound money, so that we don't have unequal weights and measures. And then in the rebuttal, I'll get into some kind of examples of specific companies and examples of how minimum wage and different practices might cause problems. Thanks.
All right, you still have 2 minutes left. You want to use them?
No, I think I'll wait. If I try to start, then I'll just cut myself off in 2 minutes. So I'm good having Chris can have my 2 minutes.
Chris, do you accept these 2 minutes?
If I need them. Who knows? I might end up being short too. We'll find out. We'll find out in a few minutes.
All right. Well, I'll do that. I'll end the time now, and then Chris, when you're ready, we'll begin your 20. And then, how do I sound? I've been talking to Keith. He's been telling me good ways to adjust this. Keith, do I sound good? All right, sweet.
Sweet. Yeah, so
Right.
just give me a verbal cue, just like you did, like 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, and I was gonna do 5 and 2. Is that gonna be too much, or are you cool just 5?
It's fine. It's perfect. 5 and 2.
Cool. All right. Well, Chris, are you ready?
Yes.
All right, and begin.
Okay. I'm going to be arguing that fair wages are the type of thing that Christians should care about and be advocating for. The reason that I'm arguing for this is because I believe that Christianity is inherently a socio-political religion. For that reason, it really doesn't surprise me all that much that a lot of Christians intermingle their Christianity with their politics. I think the real problem is that sometimes people don't have a very clear picture of the biblical politics, so they take their cues from culture, our modern culture, and often that ends up with us drawing the wrong types of conclusions. I think in part it's because some of the ways, as Steve pointed out earlier with the first verse in that passage where it's in Leviticus 19, where it's commanding the rich people to, be generous and share benevolently with the poor, that doesn't fit their political mode. So because it doesn't fit their modern political mode, they either omit it, ignore it, as Steve pointed out, or they try to circumvent it and come up with some other ethical reason or find some other passage of scripture to try to justify some other point that they think undermines it. But I'm not going to get too far into that. But the point of me referencing that is because things like that we label today as social justice, and as soon as we label it with this label that has a negative political connotation, we see, all you gotta do is look at Facebook and you see how people look at those labels and they interact with the label rather than interacting with the idea. Whether or not we would classify the rich being commanded to share with the poor, as far as Christians are concerned, as socialistic, the reality is the scripture nonetheless commands us to do such. So, again, I'm arguing that that fair wages is the type of thing that Christians should care about and be advocating for. One of the reasons that I say this is because of passages like Proverbs 31, verses 8 and 9. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. So I recognize that this word right is the key word in properly contextualizing this passage in our epic of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present to you a couple other passages on wages and biblical ethics, because surprise, surprise, the Bible, it's a socio-political religion. It talks a lot about wages. Just do a word search and you'll be surprised how many times the Bible talks about wages and the significance of them. But I'm just going to highlight 3 verses for us today. One is Deuteronomy 24 and 14. Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Proverbs 22 and 16. One who oppresses the poor to increase his wealth. Wait a minute, that verse is cut off. It doesn't have the end of that verse. So let me get over here. Proverbs 22 and 16. Give me a second. I didn't realize that. Proverbs 22 and 16 says, one who oppresses the poor to increase his wealth, and one who gives gifts to the rich become poverty. It's basically it's a proverb talking about the seriousness of being the type of person who oppress the poor to make themselves rich. Use poor people, take advantage of poor people's circumstances to make themselves rich. Proverbs 22:16. And then one of the more significant passages, I think, in Isaiah 58, where Israel, there's this rhetorical back and forth between Israel and Yahweh, and Israel was kind of bellyaching and complaining because God is not accepting their fast as this sort of offering from them, and God is responding and rebutting them and explaining to them exactly why he doesn't take this fast that they're on seriously. And part of his response is in verse 3, part B. Yet that on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. So Deuteronomy 24:14, Proverbs 22:16, and Isaiah 58:3, part B. So, I think that the Bible clearly communicates the ethic that it's inappropriate, it's wrong, it's evil for people to take advantage of the poor to increase their wealth, their own personal wealth, and become rich. Now, previously I talked about this is what I think grounds the fact that this is a right. This is kind of a universal ethic, or universal ethic that even though it may not be consistent with what our society today deems as a right, as for us as Christians, our ethics are governed by Scripture. I think as people of the people of God, the representatives of God, who are taking our cues in ethics from Scripture, we rightly would recognize from passages like these and many others. Again, do a word search on wages and be surprised at the number of times that you see the relevance of this in the economy of God. With this Proverbs 31:8-9, this is the type of thing that we are supposed to speak up against. Now, if that is true, the question then remains, is this type of a thing a problem in our society? And I would argue yes. As of the last census, poverty in the United States, and poverty in itself is problematic. Poverty is defined as an individual making $12,140 a year, or a family of four making $25,100. There's people who pay rent at $12,000 a year. How do you pay utilities, food, or in everything else if all you make is $12,140 a year or $25,100? So anyway, our societal standards for poverty is broken. I mean, it's what you expect from a people or people who don't take their cues from God. But I think it's important for us to recognize that this standard of poverty exists so that we understand what we're talking about when we're talking about the poor. Even if you set that aside, if you just look at statistics from income, about 37% of people in the United States, households in the United States, make less than $50,000 a year. $50,000 in a household is about 3 people. It's 2.5 people is the average household. That's about 150 million people here in America who are making a very significantly low wage when you consider the cost of living here in America. So again, my advocacy is that this here is inherently evil. Based on Scripture, based on what God commands, this is inherently evil. And this, because of what the Scripture tells us to do as Christians, speak up for the poor, this is the type of thing that we should be advocating for. I think part of the problem that part of the reason that people object to us advocating for these types of things is because we see these type of things as earthly things, not necessarily things that have eternal consequence or eternal benefit. Or maybe we do see it as having eternal benefit, but we see it as a marginally eternally beneficial thing and not necessarily a central thing. But I'm advocating that considering that Christianity is a socio-political religion. And what I mean by that is, from the various earliest passages of Genesis through the New Testament, it's talking about a king and his kingdom and his citizens. This is the story of the Bible. Yahweh is a king in the Old Testament. Go read the Psalms, go read the prophets. Yahweh is referred to as a king. Jesus is referred to as a king in the New Testament. Yahweh has elected people to represent him, and the people who represent him are supposed to be his citizens. We're supposed to live by his ethics, and we're supposed to, in one sense, as image bearers, we're supposed to be his advocates, his representatives. We're supposed to reflect God's love to humanity through God's righteousness, which in the case of Scripture would be the law. In the Old Testament, passages like Leviticus 19, where God is actually caring for people, whereas normal society people wouldn't, kind of like in our society. We're supposed to be reflecting that. And through our reflection of that, people would see that and be drawn to the community of God people and eventually become to worship the true and living God, the King who actually cares about them. In a sense, social activism, when done rightly and when properly representing biblical ethics, is a form of evangelism. We live in a day and time where I think that we reduce evangelism to an exchange of intellectual ideas. It's an exchange of truth propositions, where I think that biblically it was more often than not, evangelism was the way that you lived. It was how you loved your neighbor as yourself. That's how you represented God. That's how you showed people that God was true. And as people became a part of the God people, they would themselves begin to take on the biblical ethic and then reflect that to society, drawing even more people. But we know the story of Scripture. Rather than doing that, Israel, the representatives, the citizens, became oppressors. Go read the book of Isaiah. This is what it's all about. And Isaiah is the second most quoted book of the New Testament, right behind the Psalms. And both the Psalms and Isaiah talk a lot about the oppressed. It talks a lot about the poor. It talks a lot about advocacy. It talks a lot about God's attitude. You go do a word search on those words: oppressed or poor, justice, righteousness, and see how God feels about those things. And I can promise you, you're going to read a lot of Isaiah and a lot of Psalms, the two most quoted books in the New Testament. All right. So, this is the crux of my presentation on this point about wages. We're representatives. God has commanded us to represent him. The way that we represent him is through this sort of social advocacy, as well as this exchanging, explicitly, verbally telling people about Yahweh in the Old Testament, telling people about Jesus in the New Testament. So how are we doing today? I think that this is where the real rubber hits the road. I think as the church, we marginalize the significance and the place of this type of evangelism. We think of it again in our modern political social ethic, and it gets labeled social justice, and then people argue against you if you actually do these things or advocate these things, even though Scripture clearly advocates for it. I recall in 2015, there was a guy, David Price. He owns a company of this little startup financial company in somewhere in Oregon. And he decided to make $70,000 the minimum wage for his employees. And this was his own choice. He just so happens to be a Christian, and that was part of the guiding ethic. This principle of loving your neighbor as himself. He did, and I'm not advocating for that. I'm simply showing an example of what happened. What happened when this guy did this? What I saw on my Facebook feed, because I have a very broad, diverse group of friends, and both in the real world as well as on Facebook, is I saw a lot of my self-professed conservative friends criticizing this guy. They were calling this guy socialist and socialism. They were calling him a fool. They were talking about how his company is going to go belly up because he's young and immature and being led by his foolish heart rather than being led by solid business ethical principles. So this is what I see in my little social experiment observation from just watching my Facebook friends talk about it. As a matter of fact, it wasn't simply my Facebook friends who were doing that. There was a story written about it in the New York Times, and they said the same thing. Here's a quote. Most critics were not as ideological as Mr. Limbaugh, but were nevertheless put off by Mr. Price's deviation from trusting in the market, both to set wages, his own as a chief executive, because he paid himself $70,000 as well, and that of his employees, and to maximize his own profits. Overpaying workers may make them lazy and is likely to inspire resentment among colleagues who once sat on higher end of the pay dividend, they warn. These are the type of comments that people made in this New York Times article. There's a couple other comments as well. I'm going to post that in the comments. You guys can read that from yourself on your own. Ironically, 5 years later, we get a picture into it. His company is, I believe, doubled in size and I think tripled in revenue, because it just so happens, this guy, being an extremely generous guy of his own prerogative, turned out to be a good decision for him. And his employees are extremely happy. His revenues went up immensely, and his company is very profitable. And he still, to this day, has the same minimum wage and still takes the same salary himself as a CEO of the company. But again, I'm not advocating for all owners to do that. I think that Mr. Price was very generous, and that's his prerogative to be so. But what I do believe is that the biblical ethic of being generous, as well as, it's being fair, not generous, being fair and not using your employees as exploited, simply because you have a free market that permits you to pay as little as you can to a person so that you can maximize your profits doesn't mean that that's a right thing to do. I am convinced, based on passages that I've previously quoted, that exactly the opposite is true. It is the wrong thing to do. It is when you get into these pictures of kings in the Old Testament. This is what it says. Woe to him who builds this is Jeremiah 22:13-60. Woe to him who builds his palace by unrighteousness, his upper rooms by injustice, making his own people work for nothing or not paying them for their labor. He says, I will build myself a greater palace with spacious upper rooms. This is
5 minutes.
5 minutes. And there's other passages like that as well. So in closing, so I'm going to wrap things up myself a little bit early. Proverbs 14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Luke 12:15, then he said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. Ezekiel 31:31 says, my people come to you as they usually do and sit before you to hear your words, but they do not put them into practice. Their mouths speak of love, but their hearts are greedy for unjust gain. I think that this is what happens with Christians here in America. We take on, we care about our nation and we advocate, and we think that the solution to this often by many is to advocate through our government to resolve these issues. And I don't think that that's the case. I think that what we do as the people of God is we put these principles into practice ourselves. We model these principles. We put social pressure on our society by doing what is right and righteous before God, telling others about God. And if others come to God, then they become a larger part of this group, and our influence becomes all the more powerful. Or we can continue to do what we've been doing. We can buy into the narrative that there are politicians out there who care for us and put them in the place of God. Pledge our allegiance and loyalty to them with the expectation of them to create a utopian society that we know will never exist. The only utopian society that will ever exist is the one that God brings to earth in Revelation 21. And I'm going to end it there. So.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Very generous of you both to give up some time there at the end. So, okay. So what we're going to do now, we're going to have a rebuttal. We're going to do Steve and then Chris again, right? Is that the idea? I would imagine that's how a rebuttal works.
I don't remember.
So, again, if you guys have questions, send them to me in the chat. You could do it publicly or privately. We're going to save it for the end after an interaction between the two participants here. Chris, do you want to take some time to put some more links together onto the
Yep, I'm just going to drop them on in there while I'm listening to you and to Steve for the first couple.
Do we want to take a quick 2-minute break? Maybe get a glass of water or something like that? Anyone good?
I'm good.
I'm good. I'm ready when he is.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll do 10 minutes.
Okay.
This is a rebuttal. Let me know when you're ready, and then I'll tell you when you have 2 minutes left.
Okay. I'm ready.
All right, and go.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank Chris for doing this. I love Chris, and I love having these conversations with Chris. And it's in the rebuttal. We can kind of maybe mix it up here. Actually, I got a different background I can use for that. So this can be the rebuttal. I have the boxing ring up. So I don't actually disagree with anything Chris said. I agree that we need to be concerned for the poor, right? And I agree the rich should be concerned for the poor. And that's actually encapsulated. That was the very first point of the summation of the law in Leviticus 19. That reaping of the harvest, that doesn't just apply to, you don't leave farming and go into jewelry making so you can avoid this law. This is a metonymy. It kind of stands in. If you're a jeweler, there's principles that would apply in that situation too. This isn't just for farming. This is actually one of the 5 points. is that you should not have a hard heart against the poor in your community. That you should love them by making sure, but that they have a way to make a living too, and they can stop being poor. But this, what I have, where I struggle with Chris, is we have that agreement, and I want to put sooner or later, people make laws, and our laws can be based on these 5 principles of loving our neighbor, or they can be based on the words of loving our neighbor and do things that are actually obstructing our neighbor, oppressing our neighbor, doing injustice in court, hating our neighbor, stealing from our neighbor, and having the rich, giving the rich advantage over the poor. The rich use laws to take advantage of the poor. So I'm not against loving our neighbor. I'm trying to say the same thing as Paul. We should love our neighbor, and we should apply wisdom and knowledge to do the right things that raise up wages. What does raise up wages? We've seen that the example I gave, the war on poverty creates poverty. Why is that? There might be love behind it, but it's not filled with knowledge and wisdom. So two examples have come up in the past in a conversation that I've had with Chris. So I'm going to use those 2 examples as a way to actually put, what is it that you want to do? You love your neighbor and you want to be concerned for the poor. What is it that you want to do? You want to say it, or you want to do something? And I'm not suggesting Chris only wants to say it. I'm just saying, what is it that you want to do? If you look at the example of Amazon, and what I believe Chris was, and he can correct me, that the idea that we should be, he didn't say anything about laws, although I think they would turn into laws. We should shame Amazon because of their wages. And he can correct me if that's not the case. Average salaries at Amazon, $24,000 for certain types of jobs. That's the lowest average position, to $150,000 for other types of positions. Those are salary jobs with benefits. The lowest hourly average is $12.75. That's the lowest average. So they can hire people for lower based on whatever minimum wage is in that area. But on average, the guy that wants to smoke pot in the back room won't stay. He won't get to $12.75. Someone sticks around. The very average salaried position is $12.75. So there's people that make much more than that, and there's people that might make less than that. Amazon is commensurate with other companies. So if you want to do, I'll go on before I get into that. Here's a quick history of Amazon. Amazon made $281 billion in 2019. Now, I'm using 2019 because all of their competitors were made illegal because of COVID, and they made like zillions of dollars this last year. But it's because no one else was allowed to be in business, and a lot of people have gone out of business. It pays whatever taxes are levied against it. If a government, state, federal entity taxes Amazon, they pay it. They do not pay any more. If they're allowed to defer taxes, they defer taxes. That's what I do, and I'm assuming that's what you do. You pay what they ask you to pay. You don't pay more. So if there's a problem with the tax rates, which there is, and the tax conditions aren't fair, which they aren't, it's not Amazon's fault. They're obeying the law, as far as I know. Amazon, for 14 years, lost money. That means the rich people investing in Amazon were dumping money for 14 years. The employees were still making salaries, just like everybody at every other company. The employees were making money, but the investors were dumping money for 14 years. There was no profit until 2017. Amazon started in the 90s. It didn't make enough money to pay for its losses, and literally until 3 or 4 years ago. And then they made $1 zillion for various reasons. One is because they have an incredible product. So their salaries are average, just like other companies. They're commensurate with other companies. The reason you would shame them for their salaries is because they have more money. To me, that sounds like you're bending justice. You're being partial to the poor to defer to the great. And I can understand that impulse. The problem and the real tricky thing is that Amazon agrees with you. Amazon wants you to raise minimum wage as high as you can get it. If Amazon can get you to make minimum wage $25 an hour, they would love it, because they will pay their people $25 an hour. They'll raise their prices to compensate for $25. Everyone who isn't Amazon, who can't afford that, they literally can't afford to buy products for the price that Amazon sells them. They can't afford employees at $25. And Amazon will be the only company left. Maybe Walmart, or Amazon and Walmart. They want minimum wage. The same thing that happened in the banking collapse in 2008. We wrote regulations. We're going to control the banks. We're going to regulate the banks. The banks wrote the regulations. I worked at one of those banks. They literally wrote it. It was verbatim. Citigroup wrote the banks, the government's bank regulations. And now there's about a third as many banks as there was since 2008, because we put all the other ones out of business. So I get the love. I understand. We want to love our neighbor. If we do the exact opposite thing that would exemplify love, putting barriers in front of small businesses, putting barriers in front of people who are trying to enter the workforce. If you're 16 and you want to enter the workforce, but you don't have a skill set that is worth the minimum wage, then you're being told you can't work until your skill set is the minimum wage worth. Until you're worth $15 an hour and someone wants to pay you that, you're not allowed to work. You're removing the bottom rungs of the ladder. So, I mean, that's what I think is going on with Amazon. If you want to shame them for the right reasons. Amazon has horrible business practices. Amazon just shut down that parlor. Yeah. Was that 10 minutes, did you say?
You got 2 left.
Oh, dear. Okay. It might be that Amazon's my only example here. Let me try real quick. So
12 minutes. He can take us 2 minutes from earlier.
Okay, I got 2 minutes. Okay, good. So you gave me another example, and this one is a little different because it was I don't remember the time frame, but I'm assuming it was kind of like after slavery in the South. And let's say there's a factory in the North. Right. And now I'm not talking about the motives of people. I'm talking about the best thing to do, because the law isn't just to get you to the ideal. It's to control people who aren't interested in the ideal. So the example you gave is a company a factory in the North that hires people that are white in the North. And when people after slavery were coming up from the South, they were hiring people coming out from that context at a lower rate. And while I agree with you about the motives of the person, the possible motives of the person, I want to give you a scenario where that person should be left alone and the people that want to be employed by that person should be left alone. So you could assume it's a racism thing, right? And it very well may be, and I don't want to even dispute that that's possible. Even if it is, the result would be the same. You could say this person is one of 20 factories in his city, and he pays these white people $10 an hour at the time, whatever it was. That probably was $1 an hour at the time, right? But there's people from a different context, regardless. So I'm saying let's put this in a different light. Put the owner in a different light. There's people coming in from a different context. He may be racist. The fact that they're ex-slaves, that has nothing to do with him necessarily, but they're coming in from a different context. I could take the same example and say they came off a boat from China.
Hey, so that's time. Are we using your extra 2? Is that what you said, Chris?
I can have 2 more minutes. Yeah, I'll finish up.
Okay.
Right.
So
he has the option. He gets a competitive advantage. Let's say he's not making money. Let's say he's breaking even. He gets a competitive advantage. The current people, regardless of hire, in his context, he hires them for $1 an hour. He hires these people for 50 cents an hour, and he's able to train them until they can do the same thing, right? So now the people that he had for $1 an hour, he doesn't need anymore. He can pay people 50 cents an hour, and he develops these widgets at half the cost of labor that these other 9 companies can't do. The other 9 companies, in order to compete, are going to have to hire the same people from the same context that he needs. And they're going to have to start paying more. So the wage will drop significantly because of this new context, and then it'll start going up because they're going to start competing for the same people. So if the person has good intentions, that works. if the person is a racist, it also works. The only way it doesn't work is if the person is a racist and won't hire the people from the South, and he gets progressives to go with him to make laws against who he can hire. So now those people have nowhere to work. So that's why I think these principles, the rule of law, property rights, laissez-faire, let it be capitalism, is what's being described in Leviticus 19 with these constraints about not being able to oppress people and deal with them falsely. Sorry if I took an extra couple minutes there.
That's right. You're at 20 seconds. You got anything left?
Oh, I had 20. No, I'm good.
Okay. Are we all set?
Good.
Okay. So, Chris, you're next. Now, I can give you 12 minutes just to keep it fair and consistent, or if
Hey, real quick, someone's trying to get in. Whoever's the admin guy.
Scott too. That's me. I thought I was doing pretty good, I guess, up until then.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Those last Scots. I like that.
By the way, I think you can set the meeting up so people get right in without having a waiting room.
Well, no, based on the horror stories that I've heard on,
that's true.
I'm good. I'm good. I'm going to wait for the name. If the name is something ridiculous. Yeah, so we'll do that. So, Chris, you're going to get 12 minutes, or do you want to use your additional 1 minute to take it for 13?
12. It says to 12.
Sweet, whatever works. Okay, you ready?
Yep.
All right, go.
Okay, so I think part of where I disagree predominantly with Steve is maybe I'm misinterpreting him. If I am, he can respond to that a little bit later. But I think that he seems to be convinced that the primary way that we are going to fix these problems is through legislation. My position is that I'm not dismissive of legislation. I certainly believe that we as Christians should use the privilege that we have in participating in the process here in America. We should use that to do righteousness. I wrote a blog about it, the people of God and voting, right? But where I disagree, or where I think the real progress is made, is through changing people's hearts. And I think the reason that it's such a challenge to make progress, even though there's plenty of people's hearts change, if you look at the percentage of Christians here in America, is because a lot of these Christians turn to the political process. Some of them turn to the liberal political platform. Some of them turn to the conservative platform. But ultimately, they're predominantly turning to these political platforms and placing their hope. They're putting their allegiance, their pistis, their faith in these political platforms, and they're placing their hope, for shalom, for peace, for brokenness to be restored to right in the political process, instead of placing it where it properly deserves to be placed, which is with King Jesus, King Yahweh, King Jesus. Take your pick. Because and the true way that we resolve these issues is by changing hearts. We talked about Jeff Bezos earlier. Here's Mr. Price, the guy I spoke to you about earlier from the the business in Oregon, in Seattle, that made $70,000 generously, graciously, in and of his own accord, made $70,000 minimum wage. This is a Facebook post from him dated December 31st of this year. He says, Jeff Bezos in 2020 net worth rose 67% to $192 billion. Charity donations equaled 0.5% of his net worth. Amazon's higher worker pay and bonus equals 1.3% of his net worth. As a fellow CEO and founder who owes everything to his workers, I can't imagine how someone could hoard that much wealth. Amazon could have quadrupled its worker pay and bonus increases and still been more profitable than last year. Bezos could personally give every one of his Amazon employees, 1.2 million employees, a bonus of $60,000 and still been richer than he was at the start of the pandemic. At Gravity, that's Mr. Price's company, at Gravity Payments, a few miles from Amazon headquarters, our small business revenue fell 1% from a year ago, but we cut expenses elsewhere, like travel. to give out small raises and bonuses. As a CEO of a big business or a startup with VC investing, I'd be fired for doing this. This is why you see dozens of CEOs get year-end bonuses for slashing staff and remaining profitable. The incentives are all wrong. Okay, so this is his comment. There's also one of the articles that I posted earlier was an article that talked about, this was from 2010, and also at the New York Times, and it talked about how a lot of Fortune 500 companies slash jobs at the end of the year so that they can become profitable, so that these CEOs can attain their bonuses. I know plenty of Christians who think that there's no problem with that. And I think that that's extremely problematic because as I just read earlier in my presentation, God opposes those who oppress the poor so that they can get rich. As a matter of fact, here's a quick passage, and I know this is less of a rebuttal at this moment and more of a, me making another positive comment myself. But here's a verse in James chapter 5, verses 1-6. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and mouths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay your workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. I think that here's another one. We talked about this. He mentioned this one earlier. Leviticus 19:13. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of the hired person. But yeah, this is the Bible makes it clear. It is unethical to get rich while you treat other people unfairly. This is called oppression. But I think the problem is we take this modern ethic, and this modern ethic is, we don't see it as oppression. We see it as this is an extremely smart guy who's taking advantage of the tax code. But by your own admission, Steve, the tax code is broken. Amazon is succeeding in acquiring all of this wealth because the tax code is broken. So if us simply legislating better is supposed to be a solution, I don't see how that is a solution when some would argue that America's been a Christian nation from its inception. They might claim that it's becoming less of a Christian nation these days, but I mean, this is rhetoric that you hear commonly. Oh, America was a Christian nation. So then why is our tax code so screwed up? Why do we admire people who do unethical things like take advantage of broken tax codes to literally oppress people? To pay people a wage that, according to the statistics that I quoted earlier, makes it where people can barely survive in our society. I think that we as Christians are supposed to advocate. This is a form of evangelism. Advocate for righteousness. Speak up against oppressors and people who take advantage of the system. Speak out against these bad laws that give them this privilege to do such things. I did take one exception with the comment that you made, and I know you're a friend of mine, and you wouldn't be if you had bad intentions with it. But when you kind of made this subtle allusion to some guy making minimum wage smoking pot in the back room, I think that this is the type of thing, the type of comment that we make. The reality is, I know plenty of rich people who smoke pot. And they're no better than this poor person. And they do it when they're not supposed to do it either. For a long period of time, it was legal. A lot of people went to jail for it. This is a rant. And now there's a lot of rich people getting rich off of pot. It's on the stock market. It's being traded. This is the problem. The problem is our society is broken. It has poor ethics. And we as Christians, we're supposed to be the light, the salt. We're supposed to be the conscious, the people who call these people to account and to repent. And the way that we call them to repent is by modeling it and advocating for the righteous ethics of Scripture. And through people coming to Christ and adopting these righteous ethics and admitting it is wrong to oppress. It is wrong for you to become a quasi-zillionaire while you got people struggling to get by working for your company. Until we hold companies accountable, until we hold our society accountable, until we recognize this is literally what Christ has left us here for. He's left us here to be salt and light, and through this salt and light to evangelize, to show people how Christ is king, how Yahweh is God. I think that we're going to continue to fail, particularly if we're continuing to put our trust and hope and allegiance and faith in a political system that, by your own admission, is already failing. So I'm going to cut it, my rebuttal there. My rebuttal slash, I'm going to cut it there.
All right. Well, that was fun. Okay, so we're getting a lot of comments so far coming in, and questions. So I feel like the gate's about to break down. So let's do this for one more thing to do, unless the group prefers to do something else. Do we want to move right to questions, guys? This is for the debaters. Do you guys want to do a 5-on-5 minute kind of chess clock battle, or do you just want to start taking questions?
I would say if people have questions, they can raise their hand, the little hand, and then ask their question. Otherwise, this would if Steve is agreeable with it, we can just move straight into kind of the open format where people can either ask questions or make comments for the remainder of the time.
Okay, so during this whole time, I have 4 questions that come up that were kind of in line already. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to present them to who they're for, and then from there we'll do the hand raise thing. Okay. And now, actually, a lot of these questions are actually coming from Jason, or I got 2 from Jason, and I got 2 from Norman. So I guess those are the 2 guys. Go ahead.
What we did not want is for all the questions to go to one person.
Right.
We want to try to keep them.
Right. So I have one question that's actually for both of you, and so I don't know if Norman maybe wants to unmute and maybe present this himself, but I can read it to you guys. It's kind of up to Norman, I think, at the end of the day, but it's for both you guys to describe and to defend on. I'm just going to go ahead and read it, and then we'll start with Steve, and then after that we'll go back to you, Chris, and then we'll kind of go back and forth. And then we'll start to take hands, and then I have some other questions too that we can bring up. So is that all right? Just kind of wing it.
Sure.
That's the Scott way, at least, is to wing it. Okay. So this is for both you guys. We'll start with Steve. So it's kind of a 3-part question. I'll read it all, and if you need more verification, we'll talk to Norman about it.
And those are 3 separate questions. I'm sorry.
Okay. Do you want to read them, Norman, or would you prefer I do?
I don't mind reading them. That's fine.
Okay,
I'll be brief.
Go ahead, and we'll address this to Steve first.
Okay. So, guys, I'm going to go back to the chat. The first question asked, I think, towards the beginning, when you were talking about look, you can barely hear me. You're saying?
No. I can. If you need it, I can copy and paste it to you. I have it in a notepad.
Sure, that'd be great. But I think I remember, and when you were talking about Leviticus 19, and you were talking about basically the framework for loving your neighbor. Yes. And you gave some examples, but a lot of that, I just want to kind of get your view. Is that static and locked in to, say, if you're talking about feeding the poor or allowing them to glean from the fields, does that kind of translate 1-to-1 in just being, food? Or if you're talking about certain things of that nature, is it static, or is it the overall principle? Like, how do you apply those? Is there any room for growth as it pertains to changes in time frame, changes in culture, or even just having a more robust economy?
So, well, I guess the way I look at it is the principle is static, the principle is timeless. The context, the principle that's being communicated in that setting gets implemented in a certain way. So there's principles behind, not mixing fabrics. There's principles behind making sure you don't cut your hair. There's principles behind certain food laws. So there's principles here that are being communicated to the ancient Near East and are implemented in a specific context. But we have to take the principle, lift it up, keep the principle, and then drop it into a new context. So I think the principle is permanent. the implementation of it, I don't have a farm, so I can't leave the edges for someone to come and glean, and the poor here probably wouldn't know how to glean it anyway. I don't know how to glean it, but that doesn't mean I'm still not responsible for the principle. It still doesn't mean that I don't have to be generous because I don't have a farm. I don't know if that answers the question there or not. But.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Great. Norm, did you have another question you want to go with?
Yeah, do you want me to just go rapid fire? I don't want to jump in front
actually,
of it. Okay.
yeah, I was going to say, just go for it. Yeah, take the stage.
All right, guys, this is for both of you. Whoever wants to answer first, just kind of getting your perspective. If you want to pull up Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 4, you can refer to it. But basically, it replies or refers to the law which of loan forgiveness. I think it's every 7 years or so that it allowed for them to forgive those loans of those who were Jews. And it was an offset. And verse 4 basically talks about the elimination of the poor, of poverty, or so that there would be no poor among them. Now, of course, it was conditional upon them following the commandments. But what we see in there is that it presents a system of loan forgiveness, and the reason is to offset poverty. So with that being the case, how does this factor into the equation of fair wages and poverty reduction?
Okay. One of the things that I think that I was subtly trying to make is that I don't think that it's appropriate for us to simply take God's principles for his people and for us to try to have our society legislate these onto other people who aren't a part of God's people. Part of the reason that God's people were commanded to do these things was so that they would be light. If you go back to Deuteronomy 4, Yahweh says, then the nation, surrounding nations would say, what type of God do these people have that is so righteous, that gives them such righteous laws and gives them such wisdom, who's among them when they pray? Part of the reason that God's people are commanded to live by this righteous and just law, and for them to be about shalom, fixing the brokenness of the earth, is so that we would draw people to God. If everybody is commanded, or it's legislating, everybody's commanded to do these things, how do you make the distinction between the people of God and those people who are just, abiding by the law because that's the right thing to do? That said, I do think that I think people call America kind of a Christian nation because the reality is some of the laws that, originally were placed that guided America, the way that it set itself up as a society did come from the Bible. And you have bankruptcy laws where, if you have overwhelm yourself, you can get a do-over, a mulligan. You can, file Chapter 7 bankruptcy. You can extinguish all of the debts that you have and start afresh. So, there are some things within our system that are designed in a sense, and I think originally were designed to help poor people or people from becoming so overwhelmed that they become permanently oppressed. But at the end of the day, I'm advocating personally that Christians do the things that the Bible commands us, and Christians speak up and advocate for the biblical ethics as what is right to do, and for us to, in a sense, shame society into doing what is right, not necessarily us writing laws to force people to do these things.
You want me to respond to that?
Yeah, Steve, you want to go ahead and Norm, you maybe repeat the question for
Yeah,
Steve?
I can. Or do you need me to?
Number two,
up to you, Steve.
does the topic of fair wages in Scripture take cost of living into consideration? Is that
This was on loan forgiveness. How do we take that into consideration of poverty reduction, and fair wages?
well? I think I don't know how to. I'm sure there is a way to translate that. Some people would say, so Christians should not charge interest. I think what God had was a specific function there, similar to the Jubilee, where everyone has to return to their own land because God is trying to keep people in specific land. I don't know how much a lot of that translates. I know if you can certainly, I don't know where the line is, but you can certainly like see that payday lending is an example of something that's beyond the line, right? That's certainly abusive to be charging someone who's cashing a check for $200, $50 to cash it. So I think it does. I don't know exactly how to translate that, but I'm sure if we think it through, I can give you at least examples of the things that I know are abusive as far as loans or not. I don't know if not charging interest entirely because they didn't see interest at money as actually a commodity that you could loan to someone. I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but I know there's people that do believe that. I don't feel strongly about, about rebutting them on that.
Yes, sir. Thank you, guys. Great responses. And what I'll do in the interest of time and others, I'll combine the next two questions, and I'll start with a statement. So typically, especially when you read about poverty, you see mention often widows, orphans, and in particular, when we're talking about justice, some of the scriptures that you mentioned tonight, the foreigner. So when the Bible talks about fair wages, does it take into consideration, or can we see where it takes into consideration standard of living? And also when it takes into consideration standard of living, do we typically see the working class among the impoverished? Or is it typically, some sort of, people who are, come from broken families, or maybe they have diseases and illnesses and things of that nature?
You want me to go, Chris? I'll go. So I think cost of living is taken into consideration. And one thing I don't think we're aware of is we live like the kings and queens of those times. If you look at a Victorian age movie and look at the what's considered middle class of that time, Victorian age and before, if you look at the lifestyle of the elites, they're people who have freedom. They can come and go. They might have jobs. They have weekends. Our cost of our lifestyle is totally elevated compared to this. And this principle of, I think Chris raises kind of a straw man saying that because I've never been accused of wanting political solutions. I'm a libertarian. I want no political solutions. And I want you to remove the political solutions that are causing all the problems. So that's a bizarre claim to me. And I think it's a straw man to say, no, we should be concerned about that, when I'm saying I am concerned about that. I want to fix that. So the cost of living, and I think an example why you can't wave a magic wand and say, you know what, people should make $15 an hour. Why? Because. Why that number? Well, because, right? So why not $50 an hour? Why not $100 an hour? And I'm serious, why wouldn't that make sense? If there was such a magic wand, we would have seen it waved in the Old Testament, right? So the Old Testament, the lowest form of labor was a kind of servitude. I'm not talking about slavery, where the principles in Leviticus 19, kidnapping people, that was outlawed. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about servitude, something that is entirely ideal. It's not slavery, but it's someone allowed to sell themselves, like joining the army for 7 years for basically room and board that is below the cost of living, that is below poverty level for anyone. And the principles in Leviticus 19 are, God is not agreeing, yes, he puts restrictions on it, people should do that. That's an ideal condition. That is the condition. And the laws in the Old Testament aren't condoning those things. It's restricting them and prohibiting them, and then making you apply the principles in Leviticus 19 to raise up wages. If there was a magic wand, certainly God has it, and he could have just said, no more servitude. It's $15 an hour in the ancient Near East. That's how much we make. That's it. So everything gets lifted up by applying these principles. When Chris says, that talking about in Isaiah, the wages that you failed to pay, that's one of the principles I'm talking about in Leviticus 19. And I don't see Amazon doing that. Amazon has all sorts of other practices, but the only reason you want Amazon to pay more is because they have more. The disparity is a symptom of a different problem. It's not the problem itself. So I think cost of living does take into consideration, but the principle is not different. The principle is the same. They had people in extreme poverty, and the solution wasn't just to dump money on them. So I'm not making fun of people who want to smoke pot. I'm just making fun of people who want to smoke pot on someone else's dime. So I don't care if they're rich and they want to smoke pot. I don't care if they're poor and they want to smoke pot, but you shouldn't want someone to pay you to smoke pot. And I'm not making fun of people who smoke pot. I'm just saying that's not someone you want to pay $15 an hour for. If you can get someone else for 20, you can give them $20 an hour if you didn't have to pay this guy 15. So I don't care what you think about people that smoke pot. You can get rid of pot and talk about hoagies. He's in the back room eating hoagies. You have to pay him 15 because of some law, and you can't pay the guy that earns 15 more than that because you have to pay him 15. So the principle that exists in Scripture, Paul talks about if you don't work, you don't eat. That means that person is going to be under poverty. So poverty alone is a symptom of some other problem. You can't just take away poverty with a magic wand and make sure the person who doesn't work eats anyway and isn't under poverty. You want that person to be under poverty.
Thank you.
Sorry, long answer.
Chris, do you need me to refresh that, or you're good to
Nope,
go?
I got it. I think that it was built into my presentation that I certainly believe that cost of living is a piece of this puzzle, which is why I spoke about the statistics of the standards of poverty, which I think are significantly problematic. You know, how is $12,000? How is $12,000 the minimum standard of living in this country? You know, just rent alone. How do you even pay rent in a year if you earn $12,000? Or, you know, you got $25,000 for 4 people, right? So I talked about that. I talked about when you just look at the statistics of people of the census, and that information is at the Census Bureau. And then I also put this link to the poverty this poverty website in America here. And it's like, even if you just look at the statistics from the census, you know, you still have almost 50% of our society, people in our society, making under $50,000. Families, not just individuals. Families living off of less than $50,000. And I think it doesn't, all of us, you know, we have bills, we understand, you know, intimately that $50,000, it's difficult to live a quality life. You know, you literally can become a slave to work. You're trying to work as much as you can to earn as much as you can just to get by and to survive, rather than earning money to where you're thriving and flourishing. And I think the story of the Bible, I'll get into that some other time in the future, is about human beings, creaturely human beings thriving. That's kind of a background theme of the Bible. God wants us to thrive, not simply survive. And this is why you see in the law all of these prohibitions against oppressing people, taking advantage of people. And I think that however we resolve the problem, and I'm advocating that we resolve the problem through just speaking up what's right, living what's right ourselves, and speaking up about what's right. However anybody else thinks that we resolve this problem, you know, those are, to me, is the way. Steve, I only mentioned legislation because you mentioned legislation in your presentation, your first presentation. You referenced legislation changing the laws, whereas I know you're a libertarian, just like you know I'm a libertarian. Not once on this discussion or any other discussion, I've actually audibly told you in the past, as well as many other people, I don't advocate for minimum wage. I didn't advocate today. And as a matter of fact, all my friends, I tell them, I say, minimum wage hurts you. I say, you know what? Professionals, we don't have a minimum wage. You know what we do? We go in and negotiate our salary. And if there was no minimum wage, that's what you would do. And if you're a hard worker, if you're a person that has a skill or talent that you bring to the table, that you could go in and levy that and make a higher wage. So yeah, I'm anti minimum wage also. But you know, getting back to the answer to your question, Norman, yeah, I think that as Christians, in order for us to properly see this problem for what it is, we have to look at the way that our society is set up, and we have to look at the standard and the cost of living in our society. We have to look at average wages in our society, and we have to realize that sometimes if you go to the census, it's going to say the median income is like $68,000 per household. Well, this includes a bunch of super rich people like Jeff Bezos. That's pushing this number up. When you take off these top 10% people out of the equation, what you'll find out is that roughly 50% of people, and if it's 380 million people in America, roughly 50% of these people here in America are living off of wages that they're struggling to get back. They're not living as God desired for them and thriving. They're struggling. And I think that that's immoral. That's evil. It doesn't fit what God would want us to do. And as Christians, God would have us speak out against those things, point it out, just like David Price did when he gave, as a CEO, he critiqued a peer in Jeff Bezos and says, hey, I don't see how you can do that. Shame him. That's what we should be doing. We should be speaking out and shaming people for doing evil, unethical things.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. So I got a few more questions coming in. Norm, are you all set with yours?
Yes, sir. All set.
All right. Thanks so much.
Just real quick, this portion is open for comments also. We're officially kind of past me and Steve having our official part. So if you guys have comments also, rather than a question, this is the time where you can kind of raise your hand and get those in also.
I wouldn't mind answering some of these that I see while you're working down the list. I wouldn't. So a lot of questions have already come in.
So we have comments coming in. I'm not taking those into account. I do have the questions. Once I have that, I'm just kind of snagging them and putting them there. The next question, though, if you guys want to add one and ask yourself, just raise your hand and I'll get to you. But if you're submitting them to me, I'm just kind of going down the list. And so actually, I got one from Jason W. There's actually, they're both for Chris. So I'm thinking what we'll do, we'll take one from Jason, and we'll move on to Scott 2. Scott 2 has a couple different things that we have. So Jason, do you want to ask one of the questions yourself, or would you like me to read one for you?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. How about the voice quality is a little bad. Do you want me to read one for you?
Hold on real quick, because I have a headset on and I think that's causing it. Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, it's much better. Much better.
Okay, so my questions don't actually make sense anymore because some of, like, when you set up a debate like fair wages, like, unfortunately in our context, that kind of brings, like, our American context, it kind of brings up something. So my thing is, like, my question has always been, when you talk about fair wages, that becomes extremely subjective. Like, what is fair wages? You know what I mean? And so in our American context, we always deal with the minimum wage kind of question, and both of the brothers are libertarian. I'm libertarian as well, especially in this regard. So Chris just said he's not even advocating for a minimum wage and actually believes that the minimum wage is. So my questions don't even make sense anymore. I asked them early on before they explained. But I just wanted to say, just generally, do you think when you say something like fair wages, doesn't that become extremely subjective? Like, if I'm looking at somebody, I could say, well, $1 million is enough, because that's way more than anybody else. Yeah. Or somebody can say, well, $10 million may be enough. Like, who determines what's enough and what's too high? That's right. All I'm saying.
Yeah, you want me to go? Can I go ahead, Chris?
Sure.
So in saying I don't believe in political solutions, but that doesn't mean I'm not an anarchist. You're going to have laws. And so part of removing bad political solutions is part of that. So Chris isn't advocating a law for a minimum wage, but he's advocating shaming someone for paying a certain wage. And he's paying the same wage that other companies pay. So if the only difference is you're paying this wage that other companies pay, and the only difference is you have $1 zillion, then I don't understand, because the market should determine the wages. And if you're free of laws that prohibit people from working, right? Because one of the comments in here was referring to Amazon wages as oppression is such a stretch that you're going to break a hamstring. There's people who are oppressed, but people who willingly work at Amazon who have the ability to just go work somewhere else if they're being oppressed. I really kind of agree with that statement. The right wage is what two people can agree on, free of extortion, free of dealing falsely, and free of political busybodies telling them restricting what they're allowed to work for and what they're allowed to pay.
Yes, there's a subjective factor to it. I've had this conversation with Steve and casually with a couple other people. And my position is this, what's subjective about it is if a fair wage would look different at Amazon, Ford, it might look different at every company here in America because each company's revenues is different. But what is objective is when we look at poverty and we look at this quality of life statistics that I'm referencing from the Census Bureau. I think it is in that we can identify when a wage is not fair. And when a wage is not fair, when we know that a company is paying employees less than what a quality of life, and that combined with the fact that they're reporting these billions of dollars that they do to get their stock prices up, cutting these jobs, cutting loose of people so that these people who are at the top can make these bonus checks. I don't think that that's subjective at all. I think that's very objective, that there's an immoral thing that's taking place when people act and behave in that way. And that's the thing that I'm talking about. We should call out. We should speak out against that thing. I don't advocate for a minimum wage because I think that that's the wrong way to think about things. I think we're attracted to that because we live in this age where we want simple answers, or we want universal answers that we can just apply to anybody. But I don't think it works that way. Just as Steve adequately pointed out in his illustration earlier, raise the minimum wage to 25, you get the companies at the top able to pass that along, and then just continue to exploit as all of their competitors, which is what generally brings prices and things down, cost of living down, goes out of business. So yes, it is somewhat subjective. But what is not subjective is the Bible condemns those who get rich and live in luxury as the people that they're paying are being is described as being oppressed. In other words, they're not paying these people fairly. So yeah, I don't think that principle is subjective at all. That principle is very objective. And the way that I think that we can see when this type of oppression, which I do believe is happening at companies like Amazon, is taking place, is by simply looking at the cost of living here in America and looking at what companies here in America are paying and seeing if people are being paid fairly, adequately to survive while these companies are making billions of dollars of profit. And if they're making billions of dollars of profit, that's an illusion. That's the principle that, hey, you have the money to pay these people. You're simply choosing not to and taking advantage of these people because of their position. That's sin. That's evil. That's anti-human flourishing. We should oppose that and speak out against that.
So it sounds like you're saying having money is the basis for oppression. So I'm curious, what was the fair wage when Amazon was losing money for 14 years? What would have been the fair wage?
Maybe Amazon should have went out of business when they was losing money instead of the laws making it to where they can stay in business. As you pointed out, these broken laws are part of the problem. But we're not having a debate about broken laws. We're having a debate about fair wages. That's what we're having a debate about. Maybe back then they were paying their employees fairly, as fairly as they could under the circumstances. It doesn't change the fact that that the cost of living, relatively speaking, is the cost of living, and $50,000 for a family of three is not a thriving life, quality of life. And God wants us to have quality of life. And again, I'm not advocating for us sanctioning. I'm not advocating for us legislating these things. I'm advocating for us to simply say, call right, call wrong, and for us to put social pressure on them, both reflected through our love and grace that we live as Christians, as well as shame our society into doing what's right.
how many billion, at what level did it become wrong? So they didn't make money until 2017. Give me the number in millions or billions or trillions that it became wrong.
That's the simple answer that you're looking for that doesn't exist. Again, what is the cost of living, and when does the cost of living in America show that a person is a person that works at Amazon, because we're using Amazon as the example. If a person works at Amazon, and let's just say they have a family of they're head of household, they're the one working, they got a family of three, and Amazon is paying them $40,000 while they're making these billions of dollars of profit. I'm saying at that point in time, that is an immoral behavior for them to be taking advantage of this poor person so that they can get excessively rich. The Bible says that. That's not Chris's opinion. The Bible says that. So I don't have any feelings about pointing that out. There's no formula. There is no universal formula for when it's the case. But it is the case, like I said, if Amazon was losing money, maybe they should have went out of business. Then they wouldn't be doing something that's immoral, or at least not in the sense of not paying their employees, oppressing their employees.
Okay, so let's actually move on to our next question. It's actually kind of a group of questions, and I don't know which one's the best one to present. So Scott 2, that's Scott 2.0. If you could unmute and ask the question, that would be a little easier for me, because I don't know which one is your best priority. That is if you have a mic.
I don't see Scott 2.
I'm getting lots of questions from Scott too. Otherwise, if he doesn't, he's telling me it's hard to translate in the. Are you able to talk, Scott too? I see you in the comments. You've been talking to us a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, is that Scott Cherry?
Yeah.
Oh, you could be Scott 1, man. I'll be Scott 2.
I had to switch from my laptop to my phone.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Well, Scott, you got a lot of questions, so go ahead and however you want. Take the stage.
Hey, listen, here's what I'm going to do. I don't know which of my questions to pick either. So
yeah, neither do I.
I'm gonna do laissez-faire. I'm gonna let Steve and Chris pick any of my questions or none.
Okay.
Okay, so only because Scott, Steve's not going to have all the questions. Do you want to just choose one, or is that the point you're trying to make?
I'll choose one real quick one. Is the government's or people's job to make sure that companies or CEOs don't commit the sin of excessive wealth? In my opinion, it's not the government's job, and it's not the people's job. It is the people of God's job. The people of God are the ones who are told to speak up for the oppressed and to speak out against this type of wickedness and evil. So while we have no legitimate means to hold these people accountable, we certainly can call sin, evil, wrong. And I think that this is what Christians should do. We should say it is immoral for a person to acquire this wealth while they're not paying their employees fairly. If they're paying their employees fairly, great. I don't have an issue. I don't have a problem with people becoming rich. Abraham became rich. Lots of patriarchs are rich in the Bible. But the difference is, from what we see expressly, they treated their people fairly. They loved their neighbor as themselves, and thus weren't committing this sin of oppression.
Thank you.
And Scott, I'm going to take one of your other questions. This is for Steve here. Is how exactly does the gleaning law principle translate to today?
I don't think there's a universal way to say that. I think if you have any business, you can leave work. You can find efficient ways to do things, or you can find ways to give opportunities of work to people. So that it could apply to any small business. If it's a restaurant, you can find work for people to do until someone comes along and writes a law and says you can't find work for them to do. Unless they can work at a certain if the labor is worth a certain amount to you. If it's your home, you can find very simply finding if you're allowed to pay kids to mow your lawn. I think that's an example. That's a very simple example, and maybe too simple. I think it's an example of that law. I don't think the law is taking away your property rights or is making a certain percentage of your. It's a very loose law. Basically saying be generous, but be smart. Don't be generous and give people things that aren't what they need. There's people who are poor because they don't want to work. No, we have a poverty problem. And in the next couple of years, we're going to have a much worse poverty problem. And it's not because people don't want to work. So don't think I'm talking about what is going to be a huge segment of society, I believe, in the future. But I'm talking individuals that don't want to work. There's individuals that don't want to work. And sometimes because of a cultural problem, they think they don't have to work. You're not doing them a favor by giving them money if they don't want to work.
All right. And then Scott, did you have any other questions?
No, that's good for now. Thanks.
All right. Okay. So now we have next is MJ. I think MJ Jackson. If you're here, I can either ask the questions for you, or if you prefer to clarify them up a little bit, I'll let you do that.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead, my friend.
I think I want to modify mine just a little bit real quick. Let me see.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is for Steve. The gleaning law principle stipulated that a person can reap as much as their ability allowed them to. Okay. Also, the reaping was based off of the edges of, said property. Okay. So let's just say that some people's property was bigger than other people's property. So the size of the property determined the edges of the property, and the ability to reap also determined how much a person would be able to reap. How would you translate the gleaning principle today? Okay. One, as far as property, this property, although it was on the property of private citizens, this property was in a certain sense given to the people to be stewards over, not necessarily theirs, but it was given to them for them to steward the property. Furthermore, this property, the edges of this property was also set aside specifically for the poor, who would basically get up off their butt and go glean. So how do you see that translated today?
I guess I agree with your characterization. So the more you had, the more generous you should be. The bigger the field you had, the more edges, the more square footage is in the edges. So I think and Chris and I guess there's nothing to debate there, because we're not talking about laws, implementing laws. Like if you have this much, then this, those first 3 rows of corn are your, or what people can glean. So I agree with your characterization. The more you have, the more generous you should be. In the case of Boaz and Ruth, it appears he was kind of like a sharecropper, because the field didn't belong to him. When they got to the part of the field that belonged to him is what it talked about. So I don't think he was wealthy, but the principle applied to him, and he's characterized as a righteous man who was applying that principle and allowing people to glean. And like Ruth, for example, took enough for food for her and her mother-in-law. But there is limitations on it. The limitations for the poor, for the person gleaning, exist too. And there's other examples, and I shared that verse where you can't bring a basket, right? You're not going to make a system out of this where you take, you can't take the edges and you have a big farming machine that goes and you make $1 zillion off of the edges of the person's property. The idea of reasoning, frankly, applies there. That's why I don't think it says something specific. And I'm a Christian for that reason, right? If I was Muslim, I would know what foot to step into the bathroom first, and specific rules that guide aspects of our life. Here we're given the principle the principle for the rich, the principle for the poor, and then reason frankly about what those edges are. Not that we don't need the poor can't get together. And if there's 51% of the population of poor, they can't dictate the new ledges. And if the rich have control over the law, they can't dictate new ledges. So I think the principles apply consistently. And if you're incredibly rich, the principle should apply. And I wish Jeff Bezos gave people more money. I am totally in line with Chris. I don't have any control over his money. And I know it won't be a solution to anything to force him to do that. It's not generosity. I don't have any concern over how much money he gives away. I know Amazon isn't just for him. People, if you look at your 401k, anyone who has a 401k, they look in there and there's some kind of US large cap company in there. And if you're poor and you have a 401k, Amazon is probably in there. So if you crush Amazon, you'll swing at the rich, but you'll hit the poor every time.
Chris, do you got anything? I got one more question after this. You got anything to say, Chris?
I mean, I just feel like this subtle point that I'm making, maybe people are missing it based on some of the questions. Because again, there's like I see Richard's question over there, and I'm only alluding to that because it's related. Since excessive wealth seems to be the issue, excessive wealth is not the issue. There's not a problem with rich people existing at all. You know, the problem is when rich people exist at the expense of oppressing people. And I'm arguing that there's a way of looking at our society and looking at our cost of living and determining when that type of behavior is taking place. And when it is, we should complain. If a company's revenues are such where they're not oppressing, they're paying their employees fair wages based on their revenues, it's not an issue. You know, no one God doesn't command that they go out of business. God doesn't set a minimum wage. But when the revenues and the pay combine together to show based on our society standard, in this case, that a person is being oppressed, they can barely pay rent, buy food and utilities and survive. That's evil. And we should speak out against that. That's what I'm saying.
All right. And this is my my last question. And it's also a statement in here as well. I think the issue with fair wages is a matter of conscience, which God has given every person made in His image. This is a matter of conscience. We don't necessarily have to have a manual regarding this or anything like that. But my question is this, okay, Mr. Steve, you've been pushing laissez-faire capitalism quite a bit. And we see some of the issues right now, even with Parler and, people on the right wanting the government to regulate what certain companies do. So I kind of see a certain inconsistency here. Nevertheless, the market determines the wages, you said. Okay, the market determines the wages. My question is this: how come the market does not also determine the wages of the owner or the CEO? Why only the wages for lower workers? Why not wages across the board per se? Why does the impersonal market just determine wages for them and not the owner or CEO? That's my question.
Okay. So the first question about Parler, right? So I agree, it's a free market principle, and the companies that are doing that are still doing something immoral. And I don't care about Parler. To me, it was like a big mega fest. So I only cared about it when it literally got shut down. They're doing something immoral to that company. I didn't bring that up because I think there should be a law against that. To me, a free market principle would be go to your 401k, and everyone who has any kind of savings that's managed by whatever company you have, if you do, you'll go to it and you'll see you probably have some kind of US growth fund. And I don't care how much it is. If you have $1,000, probably 5% is to Facebook, 5% is to Amazon and Twitter and Apple and Google, which is Alphabet, right? So you are the one, I agree with you, everyone on the right who wants a political solution to that, you are investing in those companies. So Very simple. Stop investing in Amazon if you don't like Amazon because of what they did. And personally, I find Amazon, not in terms of salaries, but very distasteful in how it treats other people, other companies and employees. I'm sure they would mistreat if they could get away with it, but their salaries are commensurate with other people, and if they paid them less, they'd go somewhere else, because it's not oppression just because you have money that you didn't give it to someone. CEO salaries are governed by a free market. If we had a free market, we don't have a free market, right? So laissez-faire capitalism is not what you're living under. We do not have sound money. We do not have regulatory policies. CEOs get huge amount of monies in companies that they're able to destroy and abuse workers, because they can go to the government. The government's going to give them more money. So the CEO that does that is able to get money from the government, gets paid more. The free market on swindlers who can get more money out of the government, the free market value of those is going up. Companies are paying more and more for people who can get money from the government, because there's no free market. No one's making products anymore. The market is entirely based on government money getting shoveled out. When is the last time a large company went out of business? They don't go out of business. They get bailed out. The CEO takes a lot of money. It's the free market. But it doesn't make it moral. And you can make it illegal, but let's make it illegal to make up money and hand it to companies. So I do want a legal solution that matches what is moral. You can't make up money and hand it to companies. So that's why CEOs are making zillions of dollars for companies where they're laying off and robbing the pension fund and destroying the company and leaving, and then having the government bail out the company.
I agree with everything Steve just said in that answer. But to me, Steve's answer is an example of what I'm saying that we should be doing. We should be calling sin, sin. You know, we should say wrong is wrong, evil is evil, sin is sin. To me, yes, the hope would one day be to undo some of this bad legislation, you know, or to write new legislation that isn't that doesn't ultimately lead to more people becoming subjects and slaves to the government. Yes, you know, but ultimately for me as a Christian, my hope is in Christ, and Christ has given me, as Steve is as well, and Christ has given us commands about these types of things. He says, speak up for the poor and oppressed, speak out against it. So to me, that's a part of the solution. That's on the table. That's how, in my mind, how we solve this problem in one sense is to simply speak up and tell people that we're speaking up and advocating for this righteousness, because we serve Yahweh, we serve God, we serve Jesus as our King, and hopefully people join us, and then we become the big lobby group. We become the people that they want to serve, and they want to gain our vote. And through something like that, yeah, maybe they might pass some righteous laws or undo some of these bad laws. That said, I'll give Steve if he wants to say anything else. But before that, it's almost 9 o'clock, and the goal was for this to be a 2-hour event, and we're almost there. It looks like we've lost half of our audience, so I can tell that fatigue is setting in. The goal for this event was for this to be what's monthly, Steve? Somewhat of a somewhat regular event, and on various topics. And the goal would also be for us to utilize, if you guys are willing, some of you, if you guys are well-read and you guys are familiar and passionate about a subject that the group might be interested in, for maybe some of you guys to take a turn as far as a debate partner on here. So that said, if you're one of those type of people, you got a topic, and you're willing to debate it and you're well read on it, reach out to me, reach out to Steve. And at some point in the near future, we might have to have just a short 30-minute, 45-minute planning meeting where we can get together, draw some topics, and get some participants. That's it for me. Thanks for coming. I'm not getting off yet. I'm just thanking you all, because this is all I'm saying for tonight. Steve got something to add to it before we close out.
No, I don't. Yeah, if you have a topic that you think would be good, I do want to make a goal of doing this at least monthly, and going from there. And I'm in the same boat as Chris. I don't have anything necessary to add, but I don't want to. So this is a kind of an official cutoff. If there's anyone who's sticking around and still wants to talk, I can stay on, and we can.
Yeah, we have more questions.
I don't want to cut people off. If I don't have any reason. any reason to leave, but I can see we can say this is the official ended, and we can
So-
have an unofficial hangout.
Yeah. So go ahead and stop the recording, Scott, and then
Okay.
anybody wants to.
All right. Well, you see, your boy was able to end it with his questions. That was fun. I did have a few more questions after after the after the fact. Laissez-faire capitalism is something else. Is I I'm for capitalism, just not laissez-faire capitalism. You know, but I don't know if Chris Bryan Samuel is still in the chat, but thinking about getting him to come on and we do a debate review because it was a good debate slash discussion, and I totally agree with Chris. I think there was a few straw men that kept being brought up, such as what the minimum wage should be, or you have a problem with people making a lot of money. I think those were, I don't think the brother meant to do that. I think those are standardized arguments that folks on that side of the fence lodge. It's a tactic, and but we should all be listening to what's being said. And I thought I'm biased, of course. Chris is my homie, and obviously that's also my position as well. So I quite naturally, I did think that he did a good job. And yeah, I mean, I thought he did a good job. Yeah. So thank you for hanging in there. And be sure to hit the like button. Please subscribe, leave a comment. I tried to film it in real time, and please forgive me. I'm still working on becoming a little bit more tech savvy and things like that, but we'll get there one of these days. But God bless you, and please leave a comment, and we'll be sure to bring you more stimulating content from that debate group. All right. God bless and peace.